Hi, I'm Abhishek Yenpure and I'm presenting our star on optimizing particle advection performance. This is the summary of our talk. First, we'll review some background related to flow visualization with particle advection, and further, we'll look at all possible optimizations to this process. We've broken down those optimization into two broad categories. The first is algorithmic and the second is parallel. And finally, we'll conclude our talk. Let's begin with the background. Flow visualization are the techniques that make flow patterns visible in order to get some qualitative or quantitative information from them. And this enables study of many fields like aerodynamics, combustion, or climate change. There's two main approaches to doing flow visualization. The first one is experimental fluid dynamics, where you actually perform an experiment and record the data or the results using cameras or other techniques. And the second technique is using scientific visualization, which again involves two main techniques, which is particle advection and texture advection. The focus of this survey is particle advection. Particle advection is the process of displacing a particle under the influence of some vector fields. And the result of the displacement is an integral curve that represents the trajectory of the particle. To explain how this process works, we have an animated example over here where we've placed one particle inside a mesh that represents a simulation. And the first step is to identify which cell of this mesh this particle belongs to. After the identification of the containing cell, the quantities related to the flow field are interpolated to the current location of the particle. And that information is used to displace the particle one step. Now, in context of a flow visualization algorithm, this process is repeated for a lot of particles going for significant durations, and that presents a computational challenge. Now, addressing that computational challenge is very important because at large scales, and especially in in situ settings, simulation and analysis share allocated resources. And algorithms need to be efficient to reduce the encumbrance on simulations or to reduce the cost of visualization and analysis. However, achieving efficiency in case of particle advection can be complex because this process involves a complex interplay of multiple components, as well as every algorithm has its own varying needs. To understand the complex interplay of various components, we've introduced the schematic of the process of particle advection. It has three tiers. The first tier represents the process of advancing a single particle. It has three steps. The first is to take an advection step. Further, you analyze that step for various kinds of analysis, whether it's storing the particle to the disk or checking its intersection with the plane. And finally, you check the termination of the particle. And this process is repeated in a loop until the particle reaches termination. The second tier involves the components that are responsible for advancing the particle by one step. This involves an ODE solver, which actually calculates the next step of the particle, and it in turn relies on a velocity field evaluator. Now, there's multiple arrows going between the ODE solver and the velocity field evaluations because in case of higher order solvers, multiple calls to the velocity field evaluation are made. Finally, the last tier contains all the components that are responsible for velocity field evaluation. The first component in it is cell location, which is responsible for identifying which cell the particle currently belongs to. And finally, we have field interpolation, which is responsible for interpolating the velocity field information onto the current position of the particle. To illustrate the varying needs of different algorithms, this slide presents four different examples. The first example we have is the top left, which represents streamlines, where series of particle advection steps are connected using lines or tubes to represent the trajectory of a particle. On the top right, we have FTLE, where flow maps generated using particle advection are used to calculate a scalar field representing the convergence and divergence of the underlying flow field. On the bottom left, we have Poincare, where steps of a particle are checked for intersection with user-defined planes to generate a plot representing punctures in the planes. And finally, to the bottom right, we have stream surfaces, which are similar to streamlines. However, neighboring streamlines are connected to form a surface. Another key concept related to different flow visualization algorithms is the workload. We define the workload of a flow visualization algorithm as the product of the number of seeds and the average number of steps required to complete the flow visualization algorithm. All four of our examples have different workload requirements to yield the best quality of visualization or analysis. In relation to each other, we characterize the number of seeds and steps used by these algorithms into three categories: small, medium, or large. For example, streamlines need small number of particles but large number of steps. On the other hand, FTLE needs large number of particles and small number of steps. Similarly, Poincare and stream surfaces have their own requirements. These workload differences between the algorithms also introduce differences in the ways to optimize computation for them. Now that we've studied the background of particle advection, as well as looked at all the components that are involved in the process, as well as looked at some of the notional examples that use these components, we'll now dive into the optimizations applied to particle advection. The first category of optimizations that we are going to look at are algorithmic optimizations. Algorithmic optimizations refer to the optimizations that are applied to individual components involved in the particle advection process. The objective of these optimizations is to reduce the amount of computation done per particle in the execution of the algorithm. That translates to minimizing the amount of work that is required to perform the entire algorithm. The components that present the opportunities for algorithmic optimizations are ODE solvers as well as cell locators. However, performing efficient I/O as well as performing some computations before applying the particle advection algorithm presents such opportunities as well, that we categorize as efficient I/O and precomputation. Let's look at optimizations for ODE solvers. Over here, usually the cost of operations is fixed. For example, the RK4 solver has a fixed number of operations that it needs to perform before advancing a particle from one position to the next, and this cost cannot be further minimized. In other solvers, performance gains can be accompanied with an accuracy trade-off. One concept for optimizing the performance could be adaptive step sizing. However, the intention for such adaptive step sizing is for the precise control over the local error of approximation. There are only limited opportunities for improving performance without sacrificing accuracy, as fewer steps and longer step sizes can be adapted, but it negatively affects the accuracy. The next class of optimizations are cell locators. Cell locators are data structures that accelerate repeated searches for containing cells. A containing cell is defined as a cell that contains the current query point. Now, in case of uniform and rectilinear grids, cell location is a straightforward process and can be accomplished using only a few arithmetic operations. However, in case of curvilinear grids and unstructured grids, we need sophisticated strategies. Now, these sophisticated strategies can be categorized into three classes. The first one being using a Cartesian background grid. The second is using tree structures. And the third, using succession neighborhood searches. The idea of using Cartesian background grids is to superimpose the unstructured grid onto a regular grid. On the right, we have an illustration for this process. Usually, we maintain a linked list for every cell of the background grid, which points to the unstructured grid cells associated with it. The process of cell location usually involves calculating the cell that contains the point in the Cartesian grid, and then traversing the associated linked list until the unstructured cell is found. However, this process has a couple of drawbacks. The first one being, if the background grid is too coarse and the cells in it are too big, the Cartesian grid can introduce a storage overhead and an extra traversal time. And the other one, when your Cartesian grid is too fine, it could lead to certain inaccuracies and finding the unstructured grid cell. In the second category of using tree data structure, we rely on using some hierarchical data structure like the KD tree or an octree. Over here, the cell location usually involves traversing the tree structure until the leaf containing the cell is encountered. However, this approach has drawbacks as well. The first being the construction costs of the tree structure can be significant. The second is, it is difficult to vectorize the tree traversal as it involves indirect addressing. The third category, that is successive neighborhood searches, usually relies on information from previous searches to guess the current containing cell for the particle. However, this is based on an assumption that between successive positions, the particle does not travel far enough and must be contained within one of the neighborhood cells of the previous known cell. The cell location usually involves two steps. The first search is performed using some another method, and the second search or successive searches rely on looking up close neighbors of the previously known location until the search is complete. The drawbacks of this approach involve decomposing the unstructured grid in tetrahedral cells. A noteworthy cell location strategy is the cell tree, presented by Garth and others. Their approach is based on the bounding interval hierarchy with a novel splitting algorithm, which they term as the fast bucket split finding algorithm. In their approach, cells are classified into buckets according to bounding box centers, and then a splitting plane is chosen such that the tree is balanced and the tree traversals are optimized. They demonstrated the effectiveness of their strategy for particle advection using GPUs. Their approach is noteworthy because tree structures are known to be difficult to optimize on GPUs. The next algorithmic optimization that we are going to look at is performing efficient I/O. Large simulations often output data in block decomposed fashion, and predicting which data block would be required by the particle next while advection is a difficult task. Loading blocks that readily contain the data for most particles to make significant progress reduces the overall execution time for the particle advection algorithm. And data layouts can be designed based on the behavior of the vector field. However, the drawback of this approach is that significant pre-processing of the data is required to build a data layout scheme. This slide presents a couple of noteworthy techniques for performing efficient I/O. The first approach is a flow-guided file layout based on access dependency graphs presented by Sane and others. Their approach constructs an access dependency graph among blocks based on the frequency of particle transitions between the blocks and is calculated in the pre-processing stage. The access dependency graph is later used to guide prefetching of blocks for particle advection in order to optimize the execution times. The second approach was by Hong and others and uses a machine learning approach termed as LSTM, short for long short-term memory, in order to learn data access patterns by tracing a small amount of particles in the pre-processing stage. The learned patterns are later used to drive the block prediction and prefetching of data for particle advection. The next algorithmic optimization strategy is using precomputation. Precomputation involves a two-phase approach where information gathered in the first phase is used to optimize computations that are performed in the second phase. Large-scale flow visualization algorithms execute as phase 2. However, the first phase serves one of three purposes. The first being designing strategies to guide efficient I/O that we looked in the previous section. The second is designing strategies for block assignments that lead to better load balancing. And the third being calculation of basis flows that help in calculating additional trajectories in phase 2. However, this approach has one big drawback, that it requires significant amount of computation in the pre-processing phase. This slide presents two noteworthy techniques that use precomputation as a means of optimizing particle advection. The first work aims for better load balancing using workload-aware partitioning and was presented by Nyonesangsi and others. In the first phase, they distribute particles randomly among blocks and advect them to determine the work contributed by each block. Later, this workload estimates are used to assign blocks to processes in a way that results in load balance computations for particle trajectories in second phase. The second work aims for faster calculation of source to destination queries based on pre-computed flow maps presented by Blyle and others. Their objective was to speed up analysis like FTLE calculation. In the first phase, they calculate the flow maps for each block based on particles entering and exiting the block. In the second phase, a mix of Eulerian and Lagrangian trajectory calculations is used to calculate the final locations of particles. Finally, as a summary of algorithmic optimizations, this table demonstrates the performance ranges for different works that have been explicitly mentioned in their papers. All the other works that don't explicitly mention any performance gains have not been included in this table. For a much more in-depth discussion on algorithmic optimizations, we refer all the attendees to our paper. Now that we've looked at all the algorithmic optimizations, now we'll switch our focus to optimizations that are available by parallelism. Parallel optimizations refer to the use of modern parallelization means, that is, the use of multi-core CPUs, GPUs, and clusters of computers. The objective for using parallel optimizations is to improve the total number of steps that is executed per second, that is, to improve the rate at which work is done. The opportunities in terms of parallel optimization is to efficiently use multi-core CPUs and accelerators like GPUs, and to efficiently use the distributed memory parallelism at scale. Let's dive deeper into parallel optimizations. In that, we'll start by reviewing shared memory parallel works. In the past couple of decades, the number of CPU cores available for parallelism have grown many folds. Just in 2001, IBM had released the first multi-core processor with 2 cores only. And accelerator hardware like GPUs are ubiquitous and allow for a lot more parallelism. Using multi-core CPUs and accelerator hardware properly can result in massive speedups for any algorithm. Particle advection is easily parallelizable and can benefit greatly using all these parallel gains. In this section, we'll discuss parallel particle advection using GPUs, parallel cell location using GPUs, and other shared memory parallelization techniques. Due to the large number of processing cores available on GPUs, they are ideal for large workloads that can allow for a high amount of parallelism. Since particle advection is embarrassingly parallel, flow visualization algorithms typically have large workloads and GPUs are well suited for them. However, optimizing performance on GPUs can be challenging, as GPUs have limited memory compared to the host memory available on most computers. Moving memory between the host and the device is also expensive, and workloads need to be large enough for leveraging all the efficient execution that a GPU can afford. In the past, GPUs have been used as a great means to execute interactive flow visualization algorithms, and this has been demonstrated by many works. Particle advection output can readily be used as an input to GPU vertex units and can offer great frame rates for rendering output. The parallelism offered by GPUs has been exploited in demonstrating performance improvements in various different algorithmic categories like feature detection, uncertainty visualization, and line integral convolutions. These studies report improvements between 8 times to 10 times that of the reference implementation. Another aspect of particle advection that has been optimized for GPUs has been cell location. Special attention is needed for cell location operation to be efficient on GPUs. The challenges for this include GPUs have limited memory, so data structures need to be space efficient. GPUs are also not well suited for operations that involve recursion, which a lot of tree structures rely on implicitly. Cell locations also involve memory accesses not friendly for the GPU usage because GPUs are most efficient when there's co-list memory accesses and tree structure traversal doesn't allow for that. However, GPUs can still greatly speed up particle advection by carefully designed tree structures as demonstrated by Garth and others, and successive neighborhood searches demonstrated by a couple other works. Other shared memory parallelism works include using multi-core CPUs. Multi-core CPUs are a great means of parallelization when GPUs cannot be used. However, most of these works that use multi-core CPUs as a means of shared memory parallelism do so in context of distributed memory parallelism. For example, Camp and their study introduced 2 parallelization algorithms for distributed memory parallelism, but they use shared memory parallelism within each MPI rank. In a follow-up study, they study the impact of the execution device and the workload, and determined which workloads are better suited for GPUs and which are better suited for CPUs. Childs in their study studied the relation between the execution device choice and the execution time of the workloads. Because of the large diversity in the available GPUs and CPUs in the last couple of years, platform portability has become an increasingly important issue. In their study by Pugmire and others, they presented a platform portable implementation in the VTKM library for particle advection. This slide presents 2 notable techniques that demonstrate efficient use of shared memory parallelization. The first work was presented by Berger and others and presented a novel approach for handling temporal data. At any given time, 3 time slices are loaded to the GPU memory, of which 2 are used for computation. In successive phases, the first time step is pruned and an additional time step is streamed to the GPU. This results in a seamless loading of data which does not disturb computation. The approach enabled interactive exploration by decoupling data management and particle advection calculation for using GPUs. The second work by Pugmire and others demonstrated a performance portable solution for particle advection using the VTKM library, which uses GPUs and CPUs in a way that offers comparable performance to platform-specific solutions. In the table presented over here, 5 workloads and 3 datasets were used. All the numbers greater than 1 represent that VTKM implementation performs better than the comparator. From this table, one thing that stands out is the VTKM implementation outperformed the GPU comparator in most cases. Now that we've studied shared memory parallelism, the next parallelization approach we surveyed was distributed memory parallelism. Distributed memory parallelism is necessary because fluid dynamic simulations produce large amounts of data. The simulation domain is often broken into blocks, resulting in large amount of data blocks which cannot fit in the memory of a single computer. Visualization and analysis over such large volumes of data requires computation to be distributed among multiple nodes as well. The challenge over here is arranging computations such that particles and data are together. Over all the works that we've surveyed for this paper, we've identified three main approaches for parallelizing particle advection in a distributed memory setting. The first parallelization method is parallelize over data, where data blocks are the means of parallelization. The second means is parallelize over particles, where particles are the means of parallelization. And the third approach is a hybrid of both of them, where a combination of the two is used. However, we've also identified the factors that influence the parallelization choices. The first one being the volume of dataset. If the volume of the dataset is small enough that it fits in memory, then parallelize over particles is a better choice. However, if the data is large, then parallelization depends on other factors. For the second factor is the number of particles in the workload. If the number of particles is small enough, the computation cost is small, that makes sense to use parallelize over data. If the number of particles is large, then other factors influence the choice. Distribution of particles among processes also leads to imbalances in many cases, so that becomes an important factor as well. The dataset complexity as well plays a factor because of presence of critical points that attract or repel particles, leaving more load imbalances. The first parallelization technique we are going to look over is parallelize over data, where m data blocks are distributed among n parallel processes. Each process is responsible for advecting active particles that occur in the data blocks assigned to it. Before advection, particles are distributed to whichever process owns the data blocks that contain them. Each process advects all the particles it can using its data blocks. It communicates the particles it cannot advect to the right process. However, the challenges of implementing this approach of parallelization are load imbalances due to the nature of the dataset, because of presence of critical points, etc., and load imbalances due to the distribution of particles, where some processes might be responsible for advecting more particles than others. However, these load imbalances have been addressed in previous works. The first one being the round-robin scheduling of data blocks, where data blocks are assigned to processes from different regions. The second is by pre-processing data, where either the pre-processing can give you an estimation of the work that is needed for each partition, that could lead to better block assignments and better load distribution. The other is partitioning the data based on vector field characteristics, where critical points can be given less on more importance. The third technique introduced was dynamic load balancing, where work is redistributed or data is repartitioned based on load balancing needs. The second parallelization approach is parallelize over particles, where m particles are distributed among n parallel processes. Each process is usually responsible to advect a proportion of particles. Particles are distributed such that spatially close particles are advected by the same process. Each process is responsible for advecting the particles assigned to it and then loading the required data blocks as necessary. However, the challenges with this approach are some particles advect for longer durations, and that could lead to load imbalances. Improper strategies for data loading may result in poor I/O performances. However, there have been works again to address these problems. These could be addressed by load balancing strategies involving clever scheduling strategies which involve work stealing or work requesting. Also, the I/O problems can be addressed by prefetching data blocks based on access patterns. These could be done by using a cache of data blocks, using graph-based models to analyze the dependency between data blocks, or by using extended memory hierarchies for performing I/O operations faster. Finally, the last strategy to parallelize distributed memory parallelism is hybrid of both parallelize over data and parallelize over particles. However, implementations of these can differ and they tend to be more complicated than the other two strategies. They are intended to offer a better load balances. The first strategy that is widely used in this kind of parallelism is using a master worker and a group strategy presented in a couple of works in the past. The other ones are using clever work stealing or requesting mechanisms when particles sit idle for work to be assigned to them. This slide presents the synthesis of distributed memory parallelism works surveyed by our paper. It does the synthesis in two tables. The first one is a table by Binyahib where she recommends the parallelization strategy to be adopted based on 4 different factors that impact the performance of particle advection. That are dataset size, number of particles, the distribution of seeds, and vector field complexity. The other table is a synthesis of the number of particles as a proportion to 1,000 cells in dataset, demonstrated in the large-scale particle advection studies that we surveyed. These counts are just indicators of the scale that are required to execute different algorithms on a large scale. Finally, the last parallelization approach is using hybrid parallelism. Hybrid parallelism refers to using both shared and distributed memory parallelisms efficiently. And this is a default means for using most modern supercomputers and clusters, as they have thousands of nodes and each node has multiple accelerators on them. However, the challenge over here is combining best approaches of optimizing shared as well as distributed memory parallelism. In terms of works that have specifically used hybrid parallelism in the past, we've seen works that use dedicated I/O threads and separate parallel computing threads that use multi-core CPUs and GPUs in order to reduce the overall execution time of algorithms. We also had a work that recommends an execution device that is the choice between multi-core CPUs and GPUs based on the algorithm being executed and the workload being undertaken. Finally, we'll conclude our talk. The survey endeavored to inform all possible optimizations that can be applied to particle advection, be they algorithm related or parallelization related. We also helped identify limitations in current research and suggest potentials for future work. First, there needs to be more work to quantify potential performance gains by choosing certain optimizations such as adaptive solvers. Also, the speedups achieved between different generations of GPUs vary greatly, and there needs to be studies that help predicting performance while switching between generations of GPUs. Second, the studies that present performance improvements in context of large-scale distributed memory parallelism only study weak scaling. Studies performing strong scaling will help establish a range of performance gains by choosing more nodes to execute the parallel workload. Finally, there is no research in terms of establishing a cost model for particle advection. A cost model will help users determine if they should choose a certain strategy of optimization over the others. By addressing all these limitations, we aspire users to be equipped with optimization workflow, where they are able to determine the workload for their algorithms, and they are able to estimate the cost to execute that workload. And based on if the costs are restrictive or fine, choose between different strategies for optimizing their workloads using parallelism or algorithmic optimizations. Thank you for attending our talk. We highly recommend, for a more deeper discussion, going to our paper and giving it a read.